What significance would it have if I were to tell you that there is a method of paying attention to your breathing as the air enters and exits your nose that is scientifically proven to have the result of helping you memorize a list of 16 numbers and to then repeat them back to the person who has said them to you? I think that the vast majority of people would say, well, that's a completely trivial scientific finding, and why on earth would anyone have done the research? A minority of people who are maybe interested in the philosophy of education might instead say, well, that's interesting for a start, but if people improve their cognitive ability in memorizing a list of numbers after being given instructions on paying attention to their breath entering and exiting their nose, how does that compare to paying attention to the end of a pencil? How does that compare to some other educational method? If the purpose is to train people to be able to do certain meaningless tasks like memorize a list of numbers so that you perform well on cognitive behavior tests, what is the most effective method? What gets the most dramatic results? Now, if you know anything about the history of science, you can get dramatic improvements in how people perform on tests of this kind by, for example, administering cocaine. Doesn't mean cocaine is good for you. In the interwar years after World War I, there were military experiments, and some people in the military were delighted with how well men-at-arms seemed to respond to being given, say, a teaspoon of cocaine. And suddenly their shell shock and their fear of battle and their sense of exhaustion and demoralization all disappeared. And not only were they alert and well-behaved as soldiers, but they suddenly had renewed energy to march long distances and so on. Now, cocaine was at that time a very new and not widely understood drug. It inspired many crazy theories. Today, nobody would describe cocaine as seriously having positive cognitive benefits. However, we can at least say that those early evaluations of cocaine were evaluations just driven by a scientific interest in what the outcomes really were. The reality is that when I look at someone like Sam Harris, who is allegedly a skeptic, but who is not skeptical at all when he applies his mind to Buddhism and meditation. On the contrary, I regard him as the lowest order of cult flunky in this respect. Unlike even a scientist investigating cocaine in, say, the 1920s or 1930s, he's not sincerely interested in the scientific content of these findings, nor is he sincerely interested in the history of the religion. I find that very sad. I find it even more sad to see the fans of Sam Harris, who are supposedly people drawn together by some kind of critical response to religion in the modern world. I find it very sad to see the excuses they're making for their hero on this topic. Now, I'm going to make a big concession here. I think that mythology can really be meaningful. I think it can be very meaningful in people's lives. I often use the example of Shakespeare. I've met people, I'm actually not one of them. Shakespeare doesn't mean much to me, but I've met people for whom reading Shakespeare is really a tremendously important and meaningful part of their identity, for whom it's almost a religion in an old-fashioned sense. I think you can look at a legend from Buddhist tradition, a mythological account, and at a minimum, I think we should all be able to agree, as atheists, as nihilists, or as religious people, that a legend of that kind can be meaningful in the same way that Shakespeare can be meaningful, that mythology can play an important role in life in the 21st century, even when we simply recognize that it is mythology, that we don't presume it has supernatural powers. We don't presume, for example, that by chanting the text, we can bring about some kind of magical change in the world. But with this concession having been stated, I think we must have the utmost skepticism, true, rigorous scientific skepticism. When someone makes a claim about the cognitive effects of having a group of 63 university students who say they're interested in meditation focus on their own breathing and follow some other instructions of that kind, and we then construct a report, a seemingly scientific report, saying that this proves the value of Buddhist meditation as having positive cognitive effects. It is only in the context of a certain sort of echo of the religious tradition that people would construe that scientific finding as having some sort of deeper and broader meaning. Having just read the actual lab report, the actual peer-reviewed medical publication that Sam Harris cites as proving that insight meditation, that vipassana meditation from Theravada Buddhism improves cognitive function, I see so many serious errors in reasoning, in construing what the results are and what their significance is. And, Sam Harris seems to me the victim of the worst kind of California-based Buddhism, in that he has been completely guileless, completely defenseless in accepting modern lies about what the ancient religion is and how the religion found in the Pali Canon relates to what both scientific and not so scientific peddlers of the faith are calling vipassana. Sam Harris, on his blog and in his book Waking Up, he completely uncritically claims that these meditative practices are representative of the most ancient and authentic form of Buddhism, of Theravada Buddhism. He gives his own set of meditation instructions. It's a list of 9 points. And he thinks that this, along with the different isolated words he takes from Pali, appear in the Pali Canon. So if you don't know, Pali is the name of a language. The Pali Canon is a corpus of ancient Buddhist texts. Really, the texts we're talking about here are the Sutta Pitaka, the collected sayings of the Buddha, or whatever you want to call it. I don't know why. I mean, if you're a fan of Sam Harris, if you appreciate what the guy has done in taking a sort of historically critical view of Islam, Judaism, and Christianity, you should be hurt by this and say, why has he so totally failed to take a similarly critical historical view of Buddhism, and specifically of Buddhist meditation? The claims he makes about vipassana are completely false. The claims he makes about breathing meditation are completely false. If you do a Google search for my name plus breathing meditation, you'll find a shocking article in which I discuss what the ancient texts actually say about breathing meditation in Buddhism. That's one of my articles that sent shockwaves around the world, although, as Madame Jacqueline Filiozat said to me, she had always been aware of this because of her own background in Sanskrit and what have you. There were definitely people who read those texts, primary source texts, who had the skills in Pali or Sanskrit or both, who did not find what I was saying surprising. But people who are the victims of this kind of mainstream packaged Buddhist meditation experience, they definitely were shocked. In general, the people who promote vipassana as some ancient authentic form of Buddhism, they have to deal with the reality that in the ancient text it does not exist at all. It's a totally false and fictional claim to say that this is the form of meditation that the Buddha taught, or even the Buddha as a fictional character in the Sutta Pitaka, that in these texts that this is something the Buddha did not true at all. And it's also partly based on a misunderstanding of the meaning of the word vipassana, frankly. Not going to get into detail. There are many other doctrinal elements of Buddhism that are totally misunderstood by Sam Harris, and that he never even did sort of a Google search on. He never looked at what's available in the English language academic literature on Buddhism, much less did he do original research or take the time to talk to somebody who would really have expertise in this area. Now, why does all that matter if Sam Harris's claim is that there is an intrinsic value to meditative practice denuded of its religious attributes? So the claim Sam Harris would have us believe is that you can extract these meditative practices from Buddhism, regard them as scientifically valid, and they still have meaning. Well, I really think nobody could take that seriously if they look in a detached way at the scientific literature. And, as I open this video by asking, what is the meaning of paying attention to your breath as it goes into your nose and out of your nose? What is the significance of that? And why would that be a more significant pedagogical tool than an ideal of education taken from ancient Greece or ancient China, ancient Rome, or a brand new idea developed through really scientific methods for what helps people perform these cognitive tasks better? So the actual, when you go through the footnotes, when you read the fine print on what the so-called mindfulness training is, it's revealed as something that is meaningless, something that has absolutely no scriptural authority, no religious authenticity, something that is a completely modern 20th century invention, not part of ancient Buddhism. And then on the other hand, the tests being performed to show changes in cognitive ability, those are also meaningless. So it can only be in the context of somebody seeking to validate a prior religious conceit, a prior religious belief. It's only in that context that this would be meaningful. Now, I would put to you the proposal, if paying attention to your breath going in and out of your nose has this effect, maybe paying attention while drawing a picture, maybe learning to shoot basketball hoops, maybe going to the gym, maybe singing in a church choir, and learning through listening how to analyze the different notes and registers, getting really good at performing in a choir, or some of the theory behind music. Maybe those things also would have the type of very modest statistical change in your ability to perform these tasks that have been set out as metrics for supposed improvements in cognitive behavior. I say this stuff, I've just been looking at the scientific studies on this. And of course, my perspective on this is partly skewed because I'm aware of the long history of pseudoscience supported by groups like TM, the Transcendental Meditation Group. And the reality is, like, the journals, but Consciousness and Cognition as a journal, for example, that Sam Harris relies on, well, the journal itself has a bias. Yes, this is peer-reviewed, but this is a journal that's almost totally devoted to promoting this type of theory. So, sorry, if you have experience how peer review works, if you publish something in a journal of Catholic studies, it's not going to be very surprising that you pass peer review with a thesis that is, flattering to the interests of the editors of that journal. So peer review is not an objective standard, it's an intersubjective standard, and it is mostly a method of censorship, not a method of scientific verification. I wish it were, but peer review is what it is. So from my perspective, Sam Harris is in a sort of doubly damned situation here. What he says about Buddhist meditation is totally invalid from the perspective of Buddhism, and only shows the terrible ignorance of Sam Harris about Buddhism. He does not know what he's talking about in the least. And, that in itself is really depressing to behold if you do know something about Buddhism, if you do care about the history of Buddhism. Although in my case, I'm a secular outside observer at this point. I'm a former scholar of Pali, the ancient canonical language. It is what it is. But connected to that is a deep sense of denialism, which is fundamentally cult-like and unscientific and unprofessional, in which he's misrepresenting completely modern innovations, mindfulness-based stress reduction, MBSR, pioneered by John Kabat-Zinn. He's misrepresenting this as if it were validated by, arose from, represented ancient Buddhist tradition. Now, if it doesn't, if we're just looking at these modern meditation cults, if we're just analyzing them as phenomena of modern religion, then they stand on the same level as something like Scientology. Now, I cannot tell you as an objective scientific fact that nothing the Scientologists do get positive results. A significant part of what Scientology does for people is basically ripped off of modern psychotherapy. They sit down and talk to people about their dreams, they talk to people about their problems, they talk to people about their prior incarnations, they talk to people about their feelings. I think inevitably that probably has some kind of positive benefit that's measurable scientifically. It probably has a positive cognitive benefit as well as an emotional benefit as well as relieving anxiety and depression. But Scientology is bad and evil and immoral and wrong. And yeah, I would be horrified to see someone doing exactly what Sam Harris does here for Scientology. Why is it that the fans of Sam Harris are so uncritical and do not feel horrified at all to see their supposedly secular, supposedly skeptical leader endorsing the lowest grade of modern white Western pseudo-Buddhism? Would it be better if he engaged with real Buddhism? My answer is yes. I think that if his engagement with Buddhism, if Sam Harris was engaged with the reality of what it's like to be a small-town Buddhist monk performing funeral rituals in Cambodia, I think that would be meaningful. Even if, the engagement was completely critical, even if he saw nothing of value in the life of a village monk who performs funeral rituals. Sam Harris has just become another mainstream media flunky to put the stamp of approval on so-called Vipassana meditation out of his own complete ignorance. The real history of Vipassana arises, the single most influential figure is actually not S.N. Goenka. It's Mahasi Sayadaw from Myanmar. Mahasi Sayadaw was really the guy who made the leap into the English language with promoting this idea. And Mahasi Sayadaw's ideas about meditation were 100% modern, 100% original, 100% new. And they did not have the objective of helping you to memorize a list of 16 numbers. This is the other thing that's deeply problematic. The cognitive claims being made for the effects of Buddhist meditation have absolutely no relationship to what the outcomes are supposed to be in the religion. Now, I don't know, I don't want this video to go on too much longer, but again, we have a kind of double deception. If I'm Sam Harris, then I am lying to you about what meditation is in Buddhism. I'm lying to you about what modern meditation practices are. I'm lying to you about what they are supposed to accomplish, what the promised benefits are, what the objectives of the method are. And then also, I'm lying to you fundamentally in claiming that this is a scientifically valid enterprise that I'm engaged in, when in reality, everything he's doing is departing from and concluding with a religious tradition that he himself doesn't understand and is trying to validate it for a modern reading audience. by claiming that it's going to have medical benefits that are, if you actually read the peer-reviewed articles, extremely marginal at best, perhaps comparable to getting a gym membership, in terms of, and apart from being marginal, they're profoundly irrelevant to both the praxis being undertaken. They're irrelevant to spending hours of your life paying attention to your breath as it goes into your nose and out of your nose. And they're also totally irrelevant to the mythological tradition and the philosophical tradition of Buddhism. Let's be honest. If there's something that makes Buddhism worth talking about today, it's the philosophy. And you can look into what those texts actually say about so-called breathing meditation. You can look into what the texts actually say about so-called vipassana. And really, if you want to know about meditation, you should be looking into jhana. Jhana. Jhana is really meditation in the ancient Buddhist tradition. Yeah, you can look at those things. But, nobody in their right mind would start a discourse of this kind by saying, hey, you know what? I bet if we get a bunch of university students and pay them to participate in a scientific trial, we can get them to perform better on cognitive ability tests by having them spend hours paying attention to the sound of their own breathing. The nature of the claim and the assumption that it proves something worthwhile is profoundly problematic. And I think it's irrelevant to all of the questions about Buddhism in the 21st century that are really worth asking, and that you might have hoped an intellectual like Sam Harris would engage in the same way that he engages with real problems in Christianity and Islam.